Okay, now I've spent quite a bit of time this morning talking to you about how neurons in the visual cortex are tuned to particular orientations. So now I want to talk to you about another aspect of tuning that we see in visual cortical neurons. And we know that this information is very new to you and may be difficult to understand. So we'll be happy to review this again this afternoon when we review the material. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to new material. I want to talk about a different aspect of receptive field properties that we see in the visual system. And this is very much related to some of the questions that you were asking me earlier about what if we have conflicting information in one eye versus the other eye. Because an important function of our two eyes is our ability to see objects in depth. Remember the rotating mask illusion that I showed you yesterday afternoon? Yeah. So that information was flat. That's just a flat image, but our visual system interprets it as a three-dimensional object, a face. So in addition to color and shape or orientation, our visual system is constantly processing information about depth. And one way that that information is processed is by keeping information from the two eyes in separate pathways until the visual cortex, where it's combined onto the same neurons who now only respond to information that's coming in both eyes. And we call these neurons binocular neurons. So this complicated slide is showing what we call ocular dominance. And it's trying to show the underlying neuroanatomical connections that are responsible for binocularity or binocular neurons. So the two gentlemen, the two scientists I told you about earlier, Hubel and Wiesel, did an experiment to understand the nature of binocular neurons and how they were, how the connections in the brain created neurons that were binocular.
chanangli yora sungni di khande sugu yores la jura di tholani tandani la onza cheri bani yos khurani gi taji chi yores.
So remember that neurons don't project from one eye to the other. This doesn't happen.
Kyanzu tunanji kha chi wula na onza tasu di mik ching ni gozu mik shambala dwe jura dinde chi yo mares.
Instead, what happens is that the neurons project across the optic chiasm into the lateral geniculate nucleus, into separate layers.
Ani migi wangza di yos tanda wangza tasu di tanda nusam jura mikse nusam ni ge ni ani khawla li yor la na tanda the gi khangi le shu din li yor was.
Remember, I told you that there are 6 layers in the human lateral geniculate nucleus.
Ani thengi doas di khangi gi khangi le shu ju yos dinala rimba ta na rimba thu yos dina.
And so in this diagram, it's showing that the first 2 layers, which are the magnocellular layers, contain input from the ipsilateral eye and the contralateral eye. So this LGN has 2 layers for magnocellular, 2 layers, and the first layer, layer 1, is providing input from contralateral eye, and layer 2 is providing input from the eye on the same side, or ipsilateral eye. Contralateral, other side of the brain, same side of the brain.
Tanda di rimba dinal ta waina thangbo de nyo dinal la wangza tasu cheo ros. An thana shi thangbo di khari yor la waina lebe gi ni loga de ni lingi ros. Khorang khwan ne di chao shi waina ye la chao waina ni yungi ni su di lingi ros. An thana shi niba di cha sha waina khorang ye la yo waina ani ye ni yo waina ni su di lingi res.
And so these alternating in the LGN, the opposite side of the brain, the same side of the brain, the opposite side of the brain, the same side of the brain, the opposite side of the brain, they keep information separate. They're not binocular. We say they're monocular. They only respond, these neurons only respond to input from one eye.
Chezanta di la du bala di nesu chadin di khani lingu la waina kesi koran ye leina nesu ye chone chipa lingu la ro ani niba di na dogbe lingu res koran ye le yo waina nesu di yön chon lingu la ro as chipa jigan di ya cho chipa chadu res di cho do de res di naga di do chipa imba che kya di doba di la du bala di onza tasu rere ta waina koran chugi nesu rere lingu res niga ni lingu yo maro as nesu cho niga ni lingu yo mares chok chig ni ran lingu res.
And so I could do the same experiment with the first 3 rows of monks that I did for orientation selectivity, but now I could ask, do you respond to visual stimulation of the right eye or the left eye?
Tangwani nganzu gi cheboji cheimbas di kharla na yo le du bala ta le dang phantili ge me thele na shung le na ngobodi ni do yo jura di kor sherwas ta thanda di kharir la na mik chok khani yungwe me jura kujendi tongzo gi kujendi khani ligwe me dilo pa yan khenanzu yalen chila na chebo chidu ruas.
And when these neurons from the lateral geniculate nucleus project up through the optic radiation to the visual cortex, they also remain separate.
Ta thanda dine ni ma du ruas onza di tasu di chashi di ma du bala tagi zare di thanda cha thui di ruwa di ma du bala and koranzo loga cha de res.
So when they send axons up to the primary visual cortex, which also has 6 layers.
Tadi datin di khol tangi urlawa na tagi zate ni du ruas di ani thanda ngazu gi khol li urlawa na thanda ngarim ge tongzor ge ngarim le shu juya del li ge res and di tongzor le shu nan ta wai na ge di khari urlawa na ya dil rimba thu ge res loga.
So you could think of this like an airport, and there are separate terminals for inputs from the left eye or the right eye.
Tadi namthang ro cha sha na dig res 남탕 라가서 남도 도구나 골로가 요스 주사 디로 차션 찍디 주사 제 찍디 된사 찍 예촌이 찍이면 촌이 미니요라 디로가 차요라스.
So these blue layers, if you think of them as an airline, they can only come into terminals that are specific for that airline.
다 가서 남도기 단다 감니 로가 요로스 남도 로가 요도 다 계시 찍 Kurangi kasadi kawai lawaina papsadi di imbaina namru shimba denzo del papchu marwas dila di namru shimba iridi yan nam papsa shimba kuranzo kui loga chade was.
And it's only after these neurons project to layers above that layer and below that we see neurons that are now responding to input from both eyes. So these neurons and these neurons now project onto common neurons that now respond to both eyes.
Tatanda denilledu wala wangza tabung loga chade ras tasu loga ras deneni ya ma thungu ras kangla di thundu wala niga nisu tangsa khol tangu lawana wangza tasu chigla tangu res.
And there's a way that neuroscientists can see this pattern of termination coming from the different layers of the LGN. They can use chemicals that are transported from the eye to the LGN all the way up to the visual cortex. There are dyes, there are tracer substance that have been used to map this pathway.
Tadi gulam di serbadu jo khandes chingyur lawaina horansi gulam di da zen jodang jura je ju thanda chöje den jo piju chigyures andi thanda chöje di tene go chu ne ni kho li yu me ne kho li yu me di ta ne ni khora jo gulam de kor chigyures.
And when Hubel and Wiesel did this with their students, they discovered that in the primary visual cortex, which is shown here on the medial side of the cerebral cortex, so this is primary visual cortex here.
Tanda lebe ki cho del shashawa nasra dila di tanda di khari cha dur lawaina manjugi tanda thonzor gi lishun ju ras thonzor gi ngarim lishun di dires.
They saw that the geniculate neurons terminated in patches. So these black lines are the patches of termination of geniculate neurons that are conveying information from one eye only.
Tanda dila napu dene thungu das nemo dejo di khare lana thana jo thange leshu gi wangza thabu yora dejo ani nemo dejo res di napu dige.
And so this in the human brain is about the size of your thumbprint. That's the size of the visual cortex in the human brain.
Thonzor leshu ro di andi ngara jo cheje ta wa na lebe na ta wa na chejung khago surlana thiugi shadiga chejung diga sures.
And if you look at your fingerprint with all the ridges and swirls, the pattern looks a little bit like that.
Tadi gana koranzu gi remove jora di tanda nganzu gi theo diga remove chagiwa di ta wa na di da tau cha res.
So these black lines would represent the terminations of neurons projecting from the geniculate nucleus into the primary visual cortex. And the lines between them would be where the neurons that convey information from the other eye terminate, so they interdigitate with each other.
Tanda di napu de jo khari chungi urla na tanda lange leshu yo thegi lange leshu gi wangza tasu gi nemo dres an denju sama nemo de jo lange tanda wangza tasu jora di re gi nemo cha dres an ma khawal le dirla na tanda thonzor leshu na le dres an koros sama teshib doj de dos de dan de dres.
So this pattern is what you see when you cut through this middle layer of the cortex. You see in left eye, right eye bands.
Tanda leshu ji dos di kisi ki ni inde dene sha wainas ani khale thongu yurla na dende thongu yures di yoma che ani yeba lan dende yures.
So that information from the left eye and the right eye becomes blended at the second synapse in the visual cortex, after 2 synapses.
Ta tanda thusam ni gi jala ani tanda gulam ni nesu yungu ras thonzor da dewe di nesu duye di thusam ni gi jala ani thonzor leshu na chagi res duye di nesu duye di.
So I want to show you now how that information, when it gets blended in the visual cortex, helps us see things in depth. And so I'm passing out, Michael is passing out colored glasses, but I want you to put them on your desk for a minute and not hold them up to your eyes yet.
Michael masha da sa thanda kila. Dikhar chego che is ta thanda dikhar lena nechu di loga thambo tongzor lishun badu male du koran zu gulam loga res tongzor lishun le sa jela nechu sama durup chin chik su res la ra di swe sa king king onzu gita ngobo thoe di sablo khaga sume thongu res ra di yo che tu res.
Resist the temptation to put them on your head.
Ta di khye yo mar da Michael masha shana gol shana shalas.
Because I have to explain something.
Kainan thambo dishish gya go yo sa di nan.
So you can see in this image a field of rocks, and you can see that some of the rocks are closer and some are farther away.
Kiran thambo dipar dile chik si da sa. Di sidu gal dela do chuju ru mangbuj doas. Ta dina ta du kal par ro leble. Ina dita ta wazam gi dige ngara zo le nya yo do che din zo tharinga yo do shtungu doas.
So now if you look at this, cover one eye and look at this image.
Ta mikchi kabra and mikchi gitaro che das dir par dela.
Of course, we can still see which rocks are farther away and which are closer.
Mikchi kaba na ngon zo thong thu doas. Di khare khandi nya do khandi tharinga do lan din ro ji yo che thu doas.
That's because the visual system uses a number of different cues to understand depth, like texture, brightness, the size of an object, and whether one object is covering part of that object.
Di khajin yungur law na ngon phane ni ne chu jura din ni da lingyo res ta dala na khari ru cha sha wa na thade dinala digi tu cha do da yodang da de yora di sama ani ip da de tani an chigi chig la kap de me dil tani ani ngon ni su di yo chigi yoras.
So we think of those as monocular cues because they don't require binocular information. They don't require us to combine information from the two eyes. We can see that kind of information about depth through one eye alone or through either eye.
Ta thanda ngon mik chig rang gi taw na ge sablo khaga sume ngobo de she tu yo rak ewa che tu yo ras di mik chig gi ni thon yo ras di la ngon chig gi thon e khenam lagi yo res.
With the Losel monks in the back, please put the glasses down.
Kela mik she di piro nam ku ji sak.
Always the smart guys. So now I want to talk about another important cue that we use for depth. And this is called retinal disparity.
And that sablo khaga sume da le jora dila ani ngonsugi thanda thagi da dewi kheba su dila yores.
So in this diagram, the two eyes, your left eye and your right eye, imagine that you have a fixation point A.
Ta di mi yoma imba chashas ra di yeba imba chashas ani niga gi tasa khota dur lawana ni dil ta dures sekji do digal ta diga chashas.
When we look at A, the fixation point, it's going to fall on the fovea region here in the right eye and the fovea region here in the left eye.
Ta kesi de neji do e lan ta ga dos dil ta wa nas mi ni gai ani di datin di kholi ni su di onzo mi gi thongjung ye chole de le ki yoras de le li yoras thana shi yen dil ta wa na ni su di yen gi thongjung de le li yoras.
Oh, I'm sorry, let me make a correction. If B is the fixation point, it will fall on the fovea region in the left eye and the right eye. So the dashed line is, we're fixating B, and that falls then on our fovea.
Ale gonda sa thanda thongjung la poe jora di khadu phoglan e di mare B la ngo ta wa nas ani dine ne su shagya khadu khol phogor la wa na yeme thongjung dida ani yebe thongjung dini la phogor res B dil ta wa na.
So if your fixation point is, if you hold out your finger and that's your fixation point, that would be B. And then A is anything that's directly in front of it or directly behind it. A and C.
Tandang zo B la ni cha sha ros. B la di ne di ngara zo ta wa na khari chagir la wa na lago khapto kyang waina zugu dilang waina di nej do di b di chagyo res ta di gi dun lo yo di a di chagyo res phachu gyab lo yo di c di chagyo res.
And so while we're fixating point B, or let's say the tip of our finger held out at arm length, objects that are slightly in front of it, like our wrist, would fall on this part of the retina in the left and the right, slightly outside of the fovea. And objects behind it, say C, behind our finger, would fall a little bit more towards the nose on the retina.
tatanda diro chachona b di imba na mazu pumba lago de khaptu kyang waina zugu i tharung de kyang ta digas ti chadyo ras digi nye wala de mazu ta sikda de zu chagyo ras di tumot de tizo khol ligir la waina isu di tanda di tongchung digi ye chodo de litis thala ligyo res thang na shi di mi yoma de ta waina tongchung de ras digi ya yön chodo ligyo res ta kesi zugu digi tharinga ngobojil tawai nasra si di chagras zugudil tharinga lo du si di ro thanda di tende ji tawai na digi ne su di khol ligur lo na tongjong gi chujo del ligur res ye da yun ni ga tawai na nangcho nagu choju do del ligur res.
So your visual system can use this information to interpret depth.
Di ne su di le ni ani tongjor mala gi ngaran su gi sablo khaga su me jora di ani shetu res.
And you can do a little experiment right now where you hold out your thumb and you look at your thumb first through your right eye and then your left eye quickly. And you'll see that it jumps. It appears to jump.
An kiranju taje di che res khaptu kyang razu labadi theu di lang ani mi gebe gita ani ha jalo yoma gita lamsa yebe yoma jogo jeblas sume jura chik dang chik zum che jogo chiona zugudi chongyo do thungures ne logo.
How many of you can see you don't move your thumb, but it appears that the thumb moves slightly.
요거 단다 누구도 요거 지게 요 말에서 랑자 샤샤라 네 찍라 네 따도 가르 통구를 나와나 사자 배우요도 통구요 레스트.
And the reason for that is the separation between our two eyes. That's because one eye is looking slightly from the right and the other eye is looking slightly from the left.
디 가르친 그rel라 와이나스라 믹직 숨직 당치고라 이 초디기 따다운디 가르르라나 디스 추조 따비오라스 연 초디기 디스 파니 따비오라스 수구 디스 만도 차기도아스.
And if these disparities are present, then our visual system interprets that as an object in depth. It automatically interprets that depth information through those neurons that are binocular in the visual cortex.
딜레도 믹 탄다 니통기 규 믹통에 저라 통나데 디 요에갑수 디 표주 치니 통절 말라기 아니 모보디 사블 모보 망부 요에나 딘조 사블 카바시메 니수디라고 요레스.
So it turns out for many aspects of vision, two eyes are better than one. And we're going to now talk about something called stereo vision.
나타나 가서 남유타 와이나 믹 찍레 믹 니디 야가이로란 라고 요레스. 딜랑도 탄다 스테레오 비전 라네 초디
So as we just demonstrated with your thumb, the visual system constructs a three-dimensional view of the world by using the disparity or angles of view from your left and your right eyes.
아니 니통 규기 통솔 줘라 디 페주치니 통솔 말라기 나가지고 뭐보든지 사블로 가가 수면 디 통토고 요레스.
Because your eyes are separated in your head, each eye perceives a slightly different angle of the world.
대치 단다 속든지 네수디 링교 요라스 아미기 디 코라니 냠도 요 마리스티스 요체 도스 케바 도스 타른 루티스 요레스 간다 이기 ken게 아니 네술리엔디 수고 민다 차데 요레스디니.
And instead of seeing two different views that conflict, the visual system does its best job, it makes a guess, to construct a three-dimensional perception.
단내주 니가 surgu 민도도 통나 민도 요라스 디 니가 이네 통절 말라기 쳬바치니 지글레 딕니 아니 안주기 촉자 숨딩기 통당 주라 디 차기 요레스.
Remember that the images on your retina are essentially flat.
아니 탱그 도스 tanda ngazu thagi gala chanang sungye ji chari roas di level roas.
So the visual system does this computation in order to perceive objects in depth.
Chizanta ngazu tongzor mala gi koranzo chawa denjo charim denjo dubni an ngazu ngobodi ni sablo khaga sumedi ani shetu yores.
Now, finally, to appreciate this, I would like you to put on your glasses, and I want you to put the red lens on your left eye and the blue or green lens on your right eye.
Oh, ta thanda kiranzo yagoben nang so ma phyon lar khö ma song sara mi she. Ta thanda khö na digres ani de khare ngobodi ye chor do. Ngobodi ye che ani mao de yema chole mi di khöro ches.
Red left eye.
Mao di mi yeme cholres.
Thank you. We just wanted a picture of you. That's all. No, I'm just kidding.
Parji geche ondi chini ilas.
Okay. So if you put on your red and blue stereo glasses, you should be able to read this slide. The top line is red, the bottom line is blue, and the middle line should be caused by your visual system combining that information into a binocular image.
Dila dita thanda tayo roas dinala igi gang jido a sigro dip mau res khado ani o de ngombu res anga zo mi thanda ni thong gi thongzor jura di nesu di digdu gala ani dendesh thonggu res.
Okay, so make sure the red is over your left eye and the blue is over your right eye.
Ani di kungu relas mau di inji mi yeme chola sha ngombu di yeve chola sha res.
Now I'm going to show you some pictures, and the information in the pictures is, okay. Hello? Okay, so
to stimulate talking this.
I know, it's just really fun.
These eyeglasses.
So you're going to look at a series of pictures, and the information is shifted. The red and the blue information has a slightly different shift, so it will cause a depth perception, but you can only see it with these glasses on. These are called anaglyphs. Now you can see this because it also is stimulating your form vision, so this image has edges, so that information is not in color. So an anaglyph is an image that is a two-dimensional image that creates a perception of depth through the use of color.
Di ani thanda ngazugi ne di thaden zo pheju chini ani sablo di haku res khado pheju chi res dina. 연결증 채워서
Okay, so I'd like to try to explain how all of this information about depth, orientation, color, and even movement comes together in the visual system. So in order to do that, I'd like to ask you to take off your glasses, please.
당고보든 저 sablu kaga sume jura sablu je thana shi khato da ni cho kaga khandes de me di sangme ne su di ani chigla du yoras onso malagi tanda thonzor malagi di khandes chigyo me di kiran sol tishi gela mikshe di ma piro chis sangme bi sai me.
And we had to hunt for a long time in different boxes to find these. So please put them back in the plastic sleeves so that next year's Year 2 monks can use them.
Tadi mikshe di raila kale shu gain sara cheza ani kuch kiksho na rangjal lu ne ani shabu chis lo jema pugu de jan lo rumniol le ne zo peju chures.
Thank you, and if you would please pass them down to the end of the row, we can collect them.
Kiran zo thala shunge de di shunge jura di chola pat nangro chis thame and ru sun shabu chis.
Okay, so much of what I have to say about how the visual system puts together the kind of information about orientation, color, motion, or retinal disparity. At this point, it is theoretical. Neuroscientists have theories about how the brain does this, but we really don't understand it very well.
Tatanda nganzogi khajo khande yume ani sablu khande yume jura di sangma nganzo nisu leni thonsor mala gi chik lingi roas ani di thanda ngaranzogi gini ani te thagi da dewe ya chokho ko di yume di por she roas di sangma nisu sangma she sa res and wangza cheri bai di sangma deshe khande jola na namsha ji sha res ta ine namsha di sha yor de ine thandi ta cha sangwa ji nisu kodo yorela na yo mares di thola.
Because neuroscientists use the scientific method and generate hypotheses, make predictions, and then test those predictions experimentally. Everything that I'm telling you has a basis in experimental evidence.
Tatanda bonzo seri boy namsha dinde dinde shayar lan shigros di sama khari le shi shan shigur la na bonzo seri boy changme taje shigres di sama taje chen bangda yoro dile shi shan ani shigur res.
So the evidence is that when we record from neurons in the retina or the LGN or the primary visual cortex or in visual cortical areas outside of that, we see that those neurons are very selective to certain features. For example, they might respond only to a particular orientation of a line.
Tatanda ngonzo wangza chasu mangbu joras tanda di thongzor mala da dewe gyurim na ge shawina dige cha shawina kuranzo gita tanda chi guyen jura dilat pa we ani kuran zo yale ani me sukar ne chigran le chigyo ta cha shana tanda khajo khande de me khacho tan jura ta peshan di thik den zo ten doas di ro res.
But we don't see the world as a series of lines of different orientations. We see objects with color and shape.
Ne ngaran zo namgyu chi tanda ngobo den zo ta waina khadu ne samo thik do thong maras dinan ani yip dang khado da den de yu kyang ras.
So those initial properties that the neurons are responding to must be somehow combined and processed at higher levels to extract information that's a little bit more complex.
Diladu di ne ju sangwanyam do du ani dinini ani tis nyongjin chingi ni sul ma tangyo dindes sigures.
And similarly, as we discussed, the retinal ganglion cells can respond to red-green or blue-yellow, but somehow at higher levels of the visual system, that information is combined to detect all the colors that we can see, the entire visible spectrum.
Tanda ngazo khado kejisho na ngombo mau jangu kejisho roas an tanda rimba ya thoro le wainas dinala ani ngazo thonjor malagi ngau mau ngombo jangu chibu mai ba khado minda changma shitwe di rimba di chagyo res.
And we also know that the visual neurons are very, very good at detecting changes in brightness, like this white, light-dark edge. They really like boundaries, changes in luminance or brightness.
Chanasi ta dangi khebar jura kaud napulani digi chamche jura dia ani thanda wangza thapun de jodinde yabu yawache thu res.
So the theory is that that information about orientation and color and edges might be combined so that we could see that what we're looking at here in this field of snow is a horse, a white and a brown horse.
Ta tanda di ne chu changma nyam de duna tende roji thongro was di la du galta dinal ta das par dina di khang yores khang gi ki career lawaina ani khado kaw da di gyamu imbe ani ta ji yores.
And then finally we might add, or two other steps that we might add is retinal disparity, so that we the information from our two eyes might help us see the shape of the horse better, standing out in front of the background.
And tanashi miyum be cha tanda thagi ishe soas di ani nisu di leni ani ngaran su di tanda tingse khaga sumi jura di ani ha yores.
And what it would make this image even more salient, a stronger stimulus for our visual system, is if instead of standing still, these horses were to begin moving.
Ta thandu ne chu sero khadu ya khadu ragur lawana ta kesi di ta di yogu chigi yoinas ne su di sero dures.
And so in this way, at the lowest level of information processing, orientation, color, edges, retinal disparity, and motion are combined at intermediate and higher levels for the perception of objects in our environment, such as this horse with a dappled coat.
Ta tanda bimba ma we cherim nal cha shawana ne chu di sama chu yores khacho tan che an ta na ji khado ani dangi khebar minyombe thagi minyombe chada ani gugyo di ne chu sama nyam du ni nga ju tanda rimba thoye cherim na chu yores di sama du sa we jala ani ngobo di khari me siuj ha ku yores.
So this is really a very important summary about how the visual system extracts information from the complex pattern of light that's falling on our retina to identify objects in our environment.
Di gyuni khari ha wolo na thongzor mala gita tanda yogi gyuni da dre mangbu mido mangbu shu nyokje change ligi roas di thongzor mala gi digni ani ngobu di thong to khande suge me di to dang res.
So vision is much more than just the image projected onto our retina, and our visual system is making many more guesses and hypotheses about what we're seeing than a camera would, for example.
Ta ngonzo gi tanda thongzor mala ke je shwe gap su ta ngobo ji thonggu yo ina ngonzo ngobo digi sungi di thagi la charo chi buji di chang gi digi yo marwas di ne ju sangma du ne on thongzor mala gi digi sangma le ni ani ngonzo gi thongdang mendo chi tanda ngobo ji chang ni ju sangma chi la du ani thwai di yong yo ras di ani mi di suggestion da mendo chi su yo ras.
And so because a lot of how we see the world has to do with our previous experiences, you can imagine how confusing the world would be for a baby. Because there's so much of our visual processing has to do with our learned experiences about the environment over our lifetime. You can imagine how much more confusing the world must be to a little baby.
Ta tanda ngara so di ne su changma du chik su drup chech da di changma khali nyamyong da nyongwa ge jang ni yong yo ras di ngara so ta she ras jang ni su nyong ne she gyo ji ras di la du gal ta ngara so tigas kali yo na pugula khagas ko nyong yo res di ne su di tigela.
So for example, studies have shown that one of the things babies are very bad at doing is understanding depth information.
Ta chi khari ha ko la na ta je shidu wala pugu chunju denzo tanang jo sablo khaba swime jura di ani koranzo ko suya khabu shu cha res pugu denzo.
So this is why if you have a baby and you put the baby on the bed, you would never let the baby crawl to the edge of the bed because the baby cannot see the edge. The baby cannot detect the depth and would not know that they would fall off the edge of the bed.
Cheza pugu chunju denzo nyiri gala le shoina drone phokho yen ma ri ru das nyiri ma sala tung ru das di khajin rela na konju gi sablo gi thanda chi sowa jura sablo khaga swime di ani koranzo yo che tu yo mares ha ku yo mares.
So the next slide shows you a little bit more about how confusing the visual world can be and how much our visual system, how much work our visual system has to do for us to understand the world around us.
당어저 치 고요디 고뇨부 쇼요레스 디 뇨부요 나 신가족이다 라주기 통절 말하기 내가 간데스 치유메 디게 주라 디 아니 개좀 차도레스.
What do you see in this image? Does anyone see an animal?
디 파르나 가르 통고 도사 디나라 셈진 뒤에서 소자지 뒤에서 디나. Yes, there is.
A. What's the animal?
소자 도스무라 아니 소자 하레샤스 디. Key. A dog.
It's a dog. Yeah. It's a kind of a dog called a Dalmatian. It's a spotted dog.
The key rig di mingla khali lana Dalmatian lagi res di ki di res kaw da na buindu.
So, what our visual system is really good about doing is basically understanding the complex pattern of light and dark and shadows in our visual world and making sense out of it.
Dile do ngara ju thongjor mala di khari khewa yor la nas manjo chini thandam yogi dangle jura karada na di samani sulini jigni ani khandi me go suye jura dilani thongjor mala di khewa yor res.
So, just to summarize, our perception of the world is not simply the image projected onto the retina, but rather it's constructed through the neural circuits in the visual system. And that relies on previous experiences and memories, as well as the information coming from the retina.
Dila du thana ngjo chi ngobo di khari me thoya jura suk de jo di ngjo ngobo di gi sunge di thagila chawa chamchipu maimba di ani thanda wangje gi khan gulam mangbu ju chu de ras di cherim rodang di chama khechumbu chabe res thana shi ani ngome nyamnyo nyongwa joras dila teni ya ni su di diktu res anchik ni su chini ni su khari yong yome jora di ani kenchi res chi.
So just to summarize, we believe, and there's a lot of experimental evidence that suggests that visual perception is an active, constructive process in the brain.
Tadana ngzo thongzo tanne do nyingbo de she is dina khari lawana thongzo de she ke cherim ti and lebe nang do tube and cherim thungla ni sarsu niba chin shi sers.
And that process involves learning and memory. So as we grow up, we learn about the environment around us and we form memories, and we're able to interpret what the information coming into our eyes, in part because of those previous experiences.
Chesa neju dilendang handis len tu yor la oina ngara zo gyuni gyundu da gyundu ma zo nyoma mangbu chiling yor was di gyuni ani ma zo themba da di chama chu yor res anchi chi ni neju khari lewa di ni ga tu ni chag yor res.
Both the retina and the LGN process information about form, color, and movement.
Ani ip che khado che gujo di neju yese chinge di khari cha yor la oina thagi da ani thanda thegi langi le shu di chi yor res.
In the LGN, there are different layers that process information coming from the two eyes and information about form versus movement.
Antana the langi le shu jura digi ani nesu mi ye ni ga ni ling yor was antha na shi digi khari yese chi yor la na mobo digi yipda ani yogu.
Now, I haven't really talked to you about how movement information and form information is processed in the visual cortex separately. But that's the next aspect of vision that I want to turn to in the remaining time. What is the role of the M pathway that I talked about in the LGN and the P pathway?
Tadanda gujo da ip di yora number di diga le she ma resta jela tuzul hamal ma she is dinal chik ngara ju gi thanda P gulam da M gulam yos digi chego khari khari me di chag yorwas.
So when I was a graduate student, well, many years ago, I was taught that we have two visual systems.
Tangara lo mangbu mola thorim lobde lobjon che kapsos ani ngala khari lapson la inas tanda thonjor mala jura dele ni yerlan shesons.
And in fact, we have, even though we perceive the world as one, we have multiple pathways for analyzing visual information. And I've been talking to you today about the retinocollicular pathway, the retinopretectal pathway, and the retinogeniculocortical pathway.
안 단다 내수 찍을 두고 요에게 귤럼 로가 요로스 자기 니차셔나 단다 통조 미도 니레서 예데 요네디 디체 대가나시 아니 자기다 단다 항일로 슈기 귤럼라 아니야 귤럼 심바지 데리 귤럼 미도 시도스 내수 찍 두고 요네 귤럼 로가 차도레스.
From the earliest stage of processing, from the first stage of processing in the retina, we in fact have small neurons that process information about color, shape, and form, and larger retinal ganglion cells that are much more interested in motion.
The bigger one for?
This is retina.
Yeah. This one is for motion?
Motion and color and form.
The tanda manzo tagina chashawana, dina la wanza tabung chunju yures, digeri de karicha de lawina, kunjogi any number da any yibjura, di yawaching chadures, and the wall like wanza tabung cherry jures, di karichurlana, yogu di is the nisuling the chadures.
And those neurons then project to the LGN, where we have the outer four layers, 3, 4, 5, and 6, that are interested in color and form, the P layers, and the inner two layers, 1 and 2, that are processing information about motion.
The jela tagi jela karili launa tail hangile sholi was dina riba two euros. Tango the new chashona karit that you chadur launa, yogu that you chadur ras mesudi, Rosadi. Any Shivam Sumba Shiwama to what the Karlaina, Kado da any number juradi, if the chaguros.
And while those neurons are doing those computations, they're keeping track of where in space they're processing that information from, which part of the visual field.
And the lega chair comes to the Dendu Doji Chadurde, in a Koran Sulita, Nesu the Kanili Majura, Kosa Hani, Nekol, di Nesudi and Lingures.
Now, this is a complicated slide, but I can simplify it just by saying that that information, if you look at the red and the blue, is transmitted through separate pathways in the visual cortex.
The dig that Nesudi, Tanda Dipardina Tana Gonyopu Chidos, the Gonyopu did that tap the wood dishijoina, the Nili Urteni, Koransu Vidosa, Gulam, Logal, what Gurlan she is.
And so, through many different stages of processing, and each of these involves an additional synaptic connection.
Dila Duta Gurim Mindo Mambuchi Chaviuras, Wanzenala, and Dinanshi any Dila Tuzam Mambuchaviures, the Gulam Dinan.
That information is sent ultimately to areas outside of the visual cortex, like this one called MT, that's only interested in understanding where an object is moving. It's only interested in movement and the direction of movement. Is it towards us or away from us, or is it moving around us?
Tatanda di nesu di ligioras, and di nesu di tonzo malana tsuures, tonzo malagi chila nech doas di kudi, nesu di dela yan juguores, and dela Koransu Kari ese chigur lawina, ngobudi yogu chejuras, yogu chidu chok hall chigame, suso chola chidu, yogu chidu yana, suso taringa yogu chidena, suso tagor la dudi, and yogu kande chigame chidandi, and nisulingi di chadures.
And the second pathway for processing information, this red pathway, is interested in object shape and color. What is the object? It's designed and specialized for identifying objects.
Tadi gulamchik tamao gadwas, digi kari ese chigur lawina, ngobu digi number 100 dus, and tanashi kado haridulajura, di ese chigures.
So if we look at this little cartoon of the brain from the side, with the retina here, and then the view of the brain from the side, we can see the information flowing from retina to LGN, from LGN to V1.
Tatanda ngazu lebo da miki pari da remote tab deuji tiyo e nasra, dina kari tsungur launa di gangla riri chunju di mik tsungur res, miki tagi gini ju di ngazu tingu hangi lesho de ligyo res, and dine lesu di ngazu V1 la ligyo res, di lebo di res kenti.
So color and form versus motion, it goes together in separate pathways to V1, parallel pathways, and then from V1, form information is further analyzed by neurons that are located in the temporal lobe.
다 단다 디네니 딱 마오 야교지 도스 디 가리기 니수다 되어 차비를 라와이나 먼저 카도다 넘버디 니수 드레스 와라 몽부시 갸다디 요구기 니수 드레스 디니 단다 귤람 로가 차드레스 디네니 디바둘리드 그가 이네 태십친 두고레스 니가 냠도 틱도 냠도 두고레스 안디 V1 기네 디 쿠이딜리고레스 V1 기 쿠이딜레 사요젤라 단다 넘버기 니수 주라 다친디 디 단다 디네니 마트 V1 니 tö니 And
so we call this red pathway described here from V1 to V2 to visual 4 area as the identifying what an object is. So we call it the what is it pathway. And this other stream moving up toward the parietal cortex from V1 to V2 to MT, this stream is analyzing the question of where is something in space? Where is it? So neuroscientists use the term stream as a metaphor to think about this information as flowing, just the way water would flow when a river comes to a fork and it splits in 2 directions.
Stream la tangi di stream la di keje ani di khajin nesu di tangi di
But of course the brain doesn't really have riverbeds and streams in it. This is a metaphor for a stream of information.
nesu di khajin the stream la tangi di kharjin dinala ngajo gyuchu de keyo maresine nesu di chuna shi di gyuchu do khathe yawache ru dos di ani dodan di do yoza ngajo stream la tangi di
So this slide summarizes then these 2 streams for spatial and object processing. So this is really how we further analyze the visual world. And this one pathway here is asking or is interested in analyzing and identifying what an object is. And the second pathway, the secondary pathway, is interested in analyzing where an object is.
Gyulam thangpo jido di kharla wona di tawena di ani ngobo di khari res la jura di nesu ringe di res ani gyulam ni ba jido as di ge ani khawalo yor la jura ngobo di nesu ringe di chado res.
So let me ask you, which pathway gets its major input from the M cells?
Tatanda dila gyulam ni dila ani M tabung jura M tabung ni nesu mangarangi gyulam thangbo de niwa khandina mangaraga yures. So what are M cells? They take elongation on the logora. So you mean M cells from lateral geniculate nuclei?
Yes,
on the rest.
From the LGN.
Res. Dig now M tabung jura. Dig in netu di any call to res. Gurin tanda tango del dugure, new del dur. Kawair lager dugure, any carriere la del dugurena, kawair lager del dugures. No, the tango the new the netu the call dugures. They want the dora. Tanda gyurim jura thangbo de nyu la ni yo che so gyurim thangbo de law na nesu khari tenger law na ngobo di khari re la drwa niwa di na khawa loyor la jura khosa tungi dirwa di ni thangbo del dure niwa del dure sa to the first pathway what is it
Okay. So let's go back. These cells are very interested in movement, motion.
the di thabung ni ji dos di khari dan thuna chimbu cha der la na kharil thuna chi gur la na yogul thuna chi yores.
These cells, the P pathway, the P cells are very interested in form, shape, color.
The P tanda thabung ji dori badi di cha sha na khunzu khari da dewa cha gur la na ani khado da namba da de dewa cha yores.
So it seems that the M cells then might be very good at analyzing where something is because they're interested in movement.
The thangbo da niwa la du wala yugu da dewa cha yores. Di la du wala ni mobu di khawa yume di da ni nisui tata ke thu ros di khawa yor le di.
Whereas these outer layers of neurons in the LGN, the P type of neurons, are much more tuned to form, shape, and color. So edges, orientations, and color.
The dia the P do cha sha na thabung di khado da yip da namba da di zo ni nisu lingi di cha do ras di dingi di.
Okay, so let's put this back together. So now we can see that even at the level of the visual cortex, the M pathway is interested in where something is in space, and the parvocellular pathway through the visual cortex and other areas is interested in what something is.
The dina lang zo thongzo relation da dewa cha do ros di la du thanda thik ngombu di khar lana M gulam di ros. M gulam di khari tung yor la waina nisu di khari cha tung yor la waina ngobu di khawa yor la di cha yor ros thang na shi mau di P gulam di ros di ki khari nisu ling yor la waina ngobu di khari image yor ib da khado da di da dewa cha yor la ra ti.
So this is an example of something neuroscientists call parallel processing.
Di thanda nganzo cheri bai khar la ur la waina thanda theship ani yesel che dang jura di la yor.
And that's why we sometimes say we have two visual systems. And so this then raises a couple of more theoretical puzzles or questions. For example, is it possible to see the world without being able to process information about motion?
The Karanzo Chiwa Bonyo Bochi Karili Lawana, Yogo Ginesu de Meoina, and Chi and the Mobot and the Kurujura, the Cornichu go to Ruesla Jura, the rest. Nisu the Eset of the Chitu Ruesland, literally the rest.
Or is it possible to see the world without processing information about color or shape, but just motion?
And the Yogo Chibu in Nesu Lenche and the Kado da Nambayora. Tige ani yib da denzu gi nisu me oina yogu chi bu gi yang anzu gi chi gi den di thong thu res la jura di ani thwa di li res.
So how many of you think that it would be possible to still see without being able to see motion?
Ta yogu me oina sra yogu me oina an chi ji den di ta kiran zu gi thong thu re la oina la ngi kha zu yes. To mo bu de yogu chi gi me oina la ora.
Not very many. Only a few. What do you think you'd see? What do you think you'd see if you couldn't see motion?
Ta yogu mena thong thu re samgu dulara ani yogu mewa na kherangi khadi thong thu re samgu dus. Khari thong thu re Zegela. Khari thong thu re la so de la. Mi kujo ta tang na khe mar. Chala de kujo tang go mar. Mo bu den chi jig den jura. Tinna la kherangi ne chu khado da diga ji da lingi res la ra. Yogu yo ma res la ora. Tinri na kherangi thong thu gu res la ra chi jig den de. Mo bu den thong thu la thong thu re la ra. Thong thu na khari thong thu res.
Khado de thong thu.
So he can see color, different colors.
What else? Would you see shapes?
And if 통도로 했어. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so in fact, we know that certain individuals can suffer damage to the parts of the brain that are involved in motion processing. One area that I mentioned was area MT.
다 단당한 속이 미카시나 가리어 라와나 단다강이 니시든지 폰이 아니 레슈 네직 톨라드여라 근데 티강이 티그레스 단당한 속이 가리차셔와나 단당한 속 요구 징이기 네수 예세 징이 주로스 안디낭이 니니 네직 셰소스 레베 쿠이디 MT 라디 디케시 톨라드로이나스.
So for example, there was an interesting case study in medicine of a woman who had a stroke that damaged only area MT.
다 야 페슨지 샤워나 키미주레스 딜라니 탄다 자가이 강이 티도 자가 강이 티니 아니 탄다 MT기 네주요 레베쿠 디톨라도레스.
And she was able to identify a teacup. She was able to identify individuals that she knew. She was able to identify objects and color.
아모기 가리 디 모진치 두고라나 남주 미수수 모신 바디랑자 모신 두고요레 모신기요레스 당나시니 모보데조 가리 그리메 차이포 엔디 차고레라는 카도 디리샬라니 사마 모진치 두고요레스 기메디.
But she couldn't cross the street.
이네 모 가리 치 두고요 말라와나 랑가 칭니 파뼈오라 타 칭니 심벌 근데 두고요 말레스.
Because she had lost the ability to tell how far moving objects were from her and whether they were close or far away.
딜러도 딱 모보든지 야마 구조 칭이 주라 디 모라니 타름료 가가 수미 주라 디 아니 예세 치두고요 말레스.
She was also very bad at pouring tea into a cup because she couldn't tell when the tea was filling the cup.
아니 지 가리강이 튀고 올라오나 모랑기 잘 누구로 와서 자인보다 하고 그래서 잡으러버다디 안 로드갑소 자 가득한 이미지라 디 아니 셰도요 말레스 모라 고추고 말스 제산 자 가득한 게면 하마고도 강이 튀고 그래서 잘내라.
And case studies like this have been used by neuroscientists to understand the deficits that occur when there's damage to these higher visual pathways.
단다다디 저기 토림기 통솔기 말아주라 딜 아니 강이 튀어나 아니 가리긴 가리가리 그냥 가리가리 왜면 디 아니 먼저 새로 받아 주 심주 따지 지기 그래서.
So this slide is meant to depict that we have multiple ways of knowing about these two different streams, lots of experimental evidence for these two parallel streams. And one is the kind of evidence I just told you, that lesions of this particular pathway result in people who cannot understand motion. So they have particular deficits, for example, in understanding how fast a car is coming towards them on a street, or when they're pouring tea into a cup.
단다 뭐니 시원한 시레스 단다 귤럼니도 딜라 아니 냠근 차와이나스 따직라 냠근 차와이나 차샤도 요구다 되어이나스 아니 코란조 단다 미딩조 가리어 라와이나 랑가 야마 드에주라 디강이 튀고레스 가진 강이 튀고 라와이나 모보지 모라든지 야마 요구 치어갑소 수수니 갱림로 가바스미 주라 갱다디 세오 예세 치두요 마레스 대안나시니 차포르바나 루도발라 차파두 칸구요 메디 예세 치두요 마레스.
Yes, it is possible to still perceive the world if you have lost the function of this where is it stream, if you have damage in the where is it stream.
제잔다 단다 네버딜 차샤와나 코란기 가와요메 단다 네주라 쿠디 디 아니 레베 쿠디 괜쇼레스 괜쇼아네게 이네 크랑기 치 지덴디 통에 통투요레스.
And likewise, these individuals also have trouble reaching out and grasping objects because this involves analysis of motion of your hand.
아니 지 쿠란조 단다 지 강에 가르치요 라오이나스 단다 디 가와요 라인네 주라디 괜쇼아이나스 디 아니 모보든 중앙조 랑바찬이 레엔 주라디 강에 튀요레스 카이나네 랑바찬 지기다 창고도 발라 랑바디 요구 치고라스 디기 단다 예세 치마도 강에라 아니 쿠란조 디 자라 랑바찬 체빌 강에 튀요레스.
In addition, we know that there are individuals who have damage to this pathway, the what is it pathway,
ta ngoi la khawa re la jura digi khu di trol di nyam gun chi wai nas larwas ta digi gang la yang gyo ta khari re la le shun juras di gulam di ani kyun sho wai nas.
In this pathway, there are neurons that are very, very specialized for recognizing faces and objects.
Ta dina la wangza thapun de zo khari re la wai na kunju gi chele khari chi la wai na tanda ne su le di dong de zo yawa che jura di che ani ngobo khari khari me di yawa chi esel chi tungi wangza thasung de chade res.
And there are individuals who have damage to this pathway that have difficulty recognizing faces of people they know.
Ta kisi lebe gi ne di do khari re la di la nyam gyun chi wai na skyn sho wai na an koran zo nam gyu ngo shim ba mi din zo ra ku zo dong din zo yawa che ma thu ani ngom she ma thu den de kang thi yo res.
So these patients, when they look at face of someone they know, they can't tell who it is.
Ta koran zo nam gyu ngo shim ba mi di dong ba di su su din la le wai na ge ku zo gi su re la na la thu yo ma res de.
But they can use other cues. For example, they might recognize the clothing or the way the person walks.
Chikna kunju gi khandes yawa che tu la na dong ni yawa che tu yo mar la ra ani kunju gi tuglo khendang da ani khomba gya dang da de ni yawa che tu yo si res.
Or if the person speaks to them, they might recognize the voice of their friend.
Thang na shi ke je shi yo kap so ani ke di ning ros mi di ta di an di ke di ne ya mo shin tu yo gi res.
So, for example, this is a kind of experiment that's been done using electrophysiology to understand neurons in the temporal lobe that process information about faces.
Ta thanda di ngan zo na ne da ma ra murgon le shin di la ni ta je shi sha gi res ani thanda lokta da thanda le za di ani shirim do da di ta je shi sha res din.
So these are neurons that are located in the infratemporal cortex, which lies in our temporal lobe right here on each side of our brain.
Di wangza dinzo nesa hol yor la wai na thanda nganzu gi murgong le shun yo nali le shun de la yor res.
And the name of this area is Vision Area 4 or V4.
And di ne khu ji ra le be khu de la khar la yor la na V4 la yor res.
So this is an experiment that was really done. This is a real experiment where an electrode was placed in V4 in a monkey.
Di tache di ngone che sha yo tache ji res. Di tache di khare kan chir la na piu do piu gon la piu gi thanda le be khu V4 yo sa de tache chi res.
And the visual stimuli weren't oriented lines like I was talking about earlier. These were the visual stimuli. The face of the monkey turned at different angles.
Ta thanda phane ni ku je khari la na nganzu khacho dan jora di te we kap so ani ku je min da la ni piu digi khacho lo lo ting res.
And at the top are the responses of the individual neurons. So every blue line represents an action potential fired by that neuron.
Ta thanda di ngom bu jik tuen do as thiri na di khare chungi la na wangsa thasu digi thanda leju ni ba tumbe tungi res.
And underneath it, this bar shows the time that this stimulus was on. So it was off, then it came on, and then it went off.
Ta di wala thik na bush tang do as di thik na bu di khare chungi la na ku je tang we kap so di thuje di tungi res di la di kap so ku je yo ma res di la ku je yo che di ku je yo ma res.
So this neuron, as you can see, fires every time it sees an image of a monkey.
Ta thanda piu gi par di thon oda ani lamsa ani wangsa thasu di ani lejum ne ba ke tungi res.
But what the neuron is especially interested in is the profile or the side of the monkey, this view of the monkey.
Sorry?
The neuron is especially, this neuron fires the most when it's viewing the monkey's face from the side.
Ta thanda piu gi dong di tuen ras par na la ani thani ta wai nas di gap so ani thanda wangza thasu din so mixe cha de res khain an di gap so leju ni ba mangshu stu res.
And it fires much less when it's shown the back of the monkey's head.
an leju nibo di nyunga tungu res khadu nyunga tungu lawana piu gi gap de tyo bainas.
So that we have many, many neurons in our brains, just like monkeys have many, many neurons in this region, the infratemporal cortex, that are very tuned to faces and specific faces of people that we know.
Dilo di nechulen jura wangza chasu de mangbu shuji chaders piu nange mangbu res wangza chasu thana shi mina la mangbu res di nechu di chik di kharida khodi chidu lana mi gi long ero di ani yesel chiyo res wangza chasu de zui.
And so this region, now we're looking at the brain from below. Here's the optic chiasm. These are the olfactory bulbs. The cerebellum is back here. And this is the temporal lobe on either side of the brain. And this region that has neurons that are very specialized for recognizing faces are located right in this region, here and here.
Anzugi wangse new some jua di res ani di tizor giri juas di res ani di wadi learning di res di ani tandana le dama jua murgon le shu di res ta tandang anzugi dong de zongun ji chi tue yawa che tue esel chi tunge jura ne lebe khu khandi cha dor lawana di res.
And so damage to this region can lead to very specific deficits and inability to recognize the faces of people you know.
Chezanta tanda khu lebe khu dela ani nyamgun show ai nasra ani jogi moshembe mi moshemba den jogi dong thong ai nege ani jog di moshema thu de de kangi thi res.
But we have other neurons in this what is it pathway that also help us recognize objects, other types of objects. So for example, these are drawings made by patients who have damage to the infratemporal cortex, and in some cases they cannot recognize objects such as keys, birds, trains, or pigs.
Ta tanda dong yeo che tu yo maris lara dinashi ngobo ya yeo ngonjin che tu yo maris an neba den jo cha shawena quran jogi ani dimi da chiu da ni phagwa da tanda me khor da den jo yeo che tu yo maris.
But if you ask them, if you showed them these objects, if you had a toy train or a toy bird and a key and a toy pig on the table, and you said, which one is the key, they would be able to recognize and pick up the key.
Ta tanda di partyo ana konjo ngonji che tu yo mari la ras ta kesi den jo gi tsimu che yo ra che rikyo ana dimi che dimi da ni che tanda cha su gyo chai ye bi jo da de me khor da de tig ni shaw na an quran chole dimi khandire la na ani konjo yo che tu yo res.
But they could only do it by feeling the different objects based on their shapes.
Ne quran so gi di yo khadu che tu yo la na la pa chani an quran so gi ib khande me ta ro che di la pa chan ib khari me ha go dil tani ani she tu yo res.
But in all other respects, these individuals might have perfectly normal intelligence and be able to function perfectly normally, except for this very specific visual deficit.
Ta tanda di kangi ji dos di ji bu yo che ma tu di ji bu ma chi nam ju chi dang ta wa na nam ju da sang ma mi shin dun din da ji bu ji kya yo res.
So just to summarize everything we've talked about, we've seen that the visual system begins with low-level processing of color, motion, and edges, orientation. That information is processed through the two eyes as separate streams, and then it's further analyzed to tell us where we are, where is something in space, the where is it pathway, or to help us understand very complex stimuli such as faces and objects.
Ta tangbo so thongzor mala da de shi na marim ni ko chugruas marim hindu bala thik da de khari me de ni chu din jule an de ne talam loga ni ya chik digi khari ha bu la na thorim ni le du bala ngobo da dige ni khawa la yume khu khawa me khosal ting yo ras ani di jela khali khali ne ma nyongjin cheru cheru du ani dong yewa che da di samali yo ras.
So why don't we end here? And I'd be happy to take any questions in the last few minutes.
Ta loti che digas cham shagis ani thanda kama khashesh khasha dinani khiram ju chiwa tangro chis.
And also just a reminder that at 3:15 we're going to meet again here. You'll have a short vocabulary quiz, and then we'll do a review session.
아니 텐술랑 예스 디칼라나 닝고 실라이 파생기 젤라 추즈숨도 종아 딱딱 좀로 치스 카인라나 숨도 종아 란조 탄다 타니기 티주주야 튼디주였디 티주 튼디데네 추즈숨다 까마 종아 딱딱 보츠엔 투졸 페로 치스
So please, when you leave, please pick up the list of vocabulary from day 2. That was the lecture on somatosensation.
제가 아니 루솔 말라요 루솔 말라 니니오 라티스와스 디단 데베 탕게 디조타 다나조 치로 쪽제가 샤샤레스 쇼부디 엔케라조 샬라마 펜콘라니 남로 치스레레
가나 데 민노로 원도해지도 초록이 주녀셔지도 민노 그나 미기 파기 다운디 거도 까부지 통라 까부 누구 까부는 통마이나 누구 까부디 그 우디 가스나 동종도 막 카든 rolon도 디니 주니니 라슈도 도노야 주니 라바는 통소 라슈도는 정어디 거기 워 주니 로레 요나 디팅기 제들지 주니 로
두테 카레 제기 유니 두고 레스 네수디야나 여기 랍 So the information from outside world is passed on from fovea to the brain, visual cortex. So how is this information carried? Is it in the form of waves or some chemicals?
So neurons can only transmit information in the form of electrical or chemical signals.
다 왕자 타수 로아스디나 참마 왕자 타수 된저게 니추이 땅고라 게리체디 디 카리규니 땅고르라와나 야나 제다 레스 야나 록다 레스 디님 땅고 레스
And the way those signals are carried is when the neuron fires action potentials, it can fire faster or slower. And each time it fires an action potential, it releases a chemical neurotransmitter at the synapse, which then triggers firing at the second neuron.
딜레디타 딜레가 치도 간데 시월라와나 단다 레줌 니버퉁기 로아스 kujen leju ni버퉁도 골라니 왕자 타수 되네니 카르퉁기 로아나 왕자 팀바요 튠sam들 딜루기 레스
아니 타마들 가스나 동선을 주세요. 딜레 창원디 동서도 파기 때는 누구 까부는 통만 누구 까부 인수로 된 가서 시공을 해야 될때 어느 레벨도 샤데를 연락 가와셔야 되겠지. 디기 가서 넘버 셔지도 디가스 넘버 셔지도 그 넘버는 가서 까부이네 까도도 이도 중에 차선 셔데라 디가스 타마타마 도노 셔데 시공을 해야 되는 데노 셔거래 연락 가와셔야 되겠지야. 중에디
나바시 디 카리 베디시
최초도 거도도 지금 가서 미기 통수지도 미기 자지데 노래 셔거래 연락 가서 타마디 라 통선 라슈세지도 어디노 가와셔야 되겠지라.
So when we look at a white pen, so we know that it's a white pen by looking at it. So where is this information formed? Is it in the eye or is it in the brain?
It's not in the eye, and it's not in the primary visual cortex, and it's probably not combined until after we get to extrastriate cortical areas, such as infratemporal cortex. So it's only there at many, many, many synapses of processing through this complex neural circuits that our brain creates a perception of a pen.
타단당아주기 누구 가오레라이저라 디 카들리고 라와나 타단아주기 타기니체 타기레리기마 태가나시니 통조르기 ngarim리슈야 델레두야이리기마 레스 디기 젤라니 가족이 니수디여주라 디 니수 참마 뒤니 아니 누구 가오레라이데 디기 제기 탄다 그림도 살아이네 디 드엘라 아니 투잠 망부제 대가나시 그림 망부 슈지 두고 레스 디 두셰게야라
Every day I get up and I walk outside and I see the terrace being built outside by the workers.
당아주 슈게 나라도 차샤오나 슈게 카드 랑와이나 아니 레가 칭이 되주기 디
And it's a process of construction, and every day it's more and more complete.
아니 디 칸고디 게기 카치글라나 니마다고 this 레가 this 치네 아니 차상 왔다 두두도 차루도 아스칼리글리
Our visual system, we say that vision is constructive because at each level of visual processing, our brain constructs an image of the world around us.
tanda nga ju khangba swela khali chik ni ta changma chik chawyo ras cha sang di ro nga ju gi tanda thongjur ta de khari shiur lawana di gyurim di chiga chik chik ni dig de na shi di shi gyures and di nyokjing ching to shadow res.
And at lower levels, like the retina or the LGN, that's a very incomplete. Our information is very incomplete. But by the time that information is processed through V1, V2, and V4, now that information is all combined about shape, color, motion, form.
Ta tanda nga ju ni chu di mi gi thagi da tanda di hangi le shu ju ya di bo du yin ba na ni chu di cha sang wa ji cha yo ma res thong zo da de di khadu cha sang wa ji cha yo lo na de ni ma do ni tanda V1, V2, V3 ya di ishin ma do san di ani chama ma do sa yo kap so ani shini ani nga ju ni ju chama durup chini khado da ip da namba da di chama ni ju du ni ani se u ji cha yo res.
But unlike the patio, the terrace that's being built, our visual system does this really fast.
Ta di do da theo gorgu yo mares khangba disik de na mong shu gorgu ra de gorgu yo mares mara jo thongzor mala lega chidan di chokpu shu yo res.
ta nga chu mi chi ge ta kau ne ta ha ko ra kau thong nyong ge ka za mi chi le ta ko ji le sha chu ro che ko kau ge le ka chi ni ga la pi kha tham me ba zo min ro me ba zo ba ina ti jin ma te le kau ne ta ji ngo cho che go na ko le ka che ni ko le ngo cho che tho na ta thong ma thong ro thong nyong ra ko ta jin ko ta sha chu ro che ni ko kau ge chi ne ta leng ge za zo me ba zo 근데 제산 다 군 통통 말아. 가오딘 통통 말아. 타마토는 미 나촌 리시 잠네 콜 가오세야 데 콜타 삼노 나라 지 라토 치토 그러베스. 나만 통사라. 다 지마 콜 샤지 다니티 가오 그치 라피 खर्चो में बजो सारा था तो जो छाई जी 콜 가오 되네 또 아니 응고보데 가오 이마가 네탄 라토 치토 그러베스. 도나 코 간데 tindik kau ko kau re samlo de alapi ka kar gi chego nas
mata mas yu cha mas ta kau thoe thong ra oi ani shawju shini ta kau thoe me jo chara
ko kau thoa ge chinelen je ga sa zo me pa zo ba ina ta jilo ngopo ji kau re sine ko shena ko te kara tre tho na
ko la shena ani kau di kor she wai nas ani chesu khandu lang gore re Okay. So his question is, if a person before surgery he is able to see white color, and if after surgery he is not able to see white color, so how can we remind him of white color? How can we describe him?
Okay. How can we teach him?
Yeah, how can we this object is white, so how we can describe him about the white color, because he cannot see white color now.
But he had perfectly normal visual experience through his life until that point.
Ta ine shaju machi kongla changma thongyo roasa.
ngoro da ta ga ta ji che gora ko kau se jamba ji ko te ayo me ta gora ta ni ko kau nyama kau che ga le ka le ki ga la ka chi ora ta thom me mar zoni.
So he's saying the nerves which works for the perception of white color is damaged now. So
there's a very interesting case study of an artist, a painter, who had damage to visual area that is devoted to analysis of color of objects.
tata na anjo remote hingi ju resta di ga la anjo taji chi 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 ta mo di she na khura khari chi tu yo marla na khado yo che jura di chi tu yo mares.
And after this artist had damage to that area of his visual processing, when he looked at a banana, he could recognize the banana as a banana, but the banana now looked gray to him.
Gray,
just no color, just shades of gray.
ta tanda tanda remoting ji pesu sha swas khora yundugal ta khora kani theni ani khado yewa che tu yumarlar was dila duta digi jela kyondi tepsa jela ani khorangi tango bodel ta oina peshana ngangla rocha sha oina ngangla ta dugala ngangla relan khorangi muji chitu gu yores ine khado thungu yomares khado tanda ta wazam ki khade rojorla na theldo roj thondi yores ngangla di.
So in fact, when he closed his eyes and tried to imagine a banana and the color of a ripe banana, he could no longer even imagine what it would look like. He could only see a banana without any color. Just imagining.
Mm-hmm. So can he imagine or not?
He cannot. He could not, in fact. So this is an actual patient.
Ta tanda korangi mitsum neta kera ngangla siu yore sam neta kera di samrona chare thamchi chila nege chidu yo mares khaina na kogi tanda ta du wala khare ngangla khandi jilta waina kogi siu thungu yo marwas theldo di thungu yo ras chezani moy ngado khado khari madi thungu yo mares.
So did that answer the question?
Tio di length sesa.
Chadani she kujina teni da khador ramda tesutide thoma kande reseyade ani leba zuiglo sidalo ani tade imba inas epena ngaranso khador da tesu thomate ji minga rang le bezon da ji thond thoma thond de daga thond da shisatne temba che de yon mikarang dewaji de yuni zone mato ye leba no be tenti ji le bezon no ajini shaum de karinas Thomas Kato Mumbo the Sibusea Tisoti, she Kujina Teni, and Kato Mumbo the Sibutinati, Thomas Chatante, Leba Zogeres, the door. And that did Leba Zoge, that's Zoge, Maranson Homala, Thomas Tondo, Mikaran, Miram Tondo, Miram Tons on the door. She's Trembaki, the Mikaran Chate, Mato, the Lebanon, the Kitty Chat, the Son of Shawin, the Karinas.
So. He said when we see objects and its color and shape, the information goes from eyes to the brain, and the brain perceives this color and the form or whatever. So when after many years we try to remember the same object, so we have the image of that object, but it looks like the image is created in the eye, not in the brain. We are able to see that, imagine that through our eyes, not through our brain. So,
well, when we imagine the object, we can imagine it with our eyes open or shut, right?
Tangajo chanang ke dugala chanang jitli roas, dille dugala mik zum na ina re mik dangwa ina re nigal chanang ke roas.
So, in fact, that information is stored. Not in our retina. There's no evidence that we have memory in our retina, but that information is stored in the cerebral cortex.
Tatanda nesu di temba ro nyar de roas. Di nesu di nganju pangda yores. Di nesu di temba nashi nyar de di migi thagile yo mares. Di nesu di khol tembe suila ko nyar de lo na lebe na nyar de pangda yores.
So it's now thought that when we store memory, we store memories in the same areas that we initially process that information in. So visual memories may be stored in our visual cortex. Somatosensory memories may be stored in our somatosensory cortex. Olfactory memories are probably stored in olfactory cortex.
Tatanda nganju temba so nyare jura. Di khol nyar gu lana lebe khuina keje shiona ngula thangbo nechu le du ga yese che jura. Di khu kho cha de na tharan la temba di nyagu res ta pe shauna thongzor da de oina thongzor le shun la yesel chini ne su di nyar ras thangbo cha de an temba di thanda di dan de temba di thongzor le shun na yo res di ne di thana chani luzur da de temba yim baina yan luzur da de le shun yo ras an de la nya di yo res di temba.
So probably when we remember our favorite meal that our mother cooked for us when we were little, we might have that memory in our visual cortex and in our olfactory cortex and in other cortical areas where we store memories of taste.
Dila dita nganju gita amai gi khala shimbu ji syo enas chungdi ra di ani temba na di roas temba di dugala tembe gi khuidi lebe khuidil ta ina temba di kho kho lo yor la ina njugi mi gi thong rang mo di khala di thong dugala ni thongsor le shin la yores di temba di thangana shi timanu me roas ani tizor da develation yores de la yores temba di thangana shi ni rodan de khala di sa yores roda de yan le shin ne lo yores khu dige sangma da digi temba di de yores.
So when we remember things, we imagine things, in many cases we're using many, many different areas of our cortex where those aspects of those memories are stored. And it's probably the activity and the connections between those areas that are the site where memories are stored.
Chezanta manzo temba di chirali ro temba swebe kapsu ani ngara zo chanang le du gola yeni temba sa ni sha gyo jiros ni gu denzu changma kuma theni la nyam do chiyores tak se khala ro cha shawn ni mangbu che so di changma nyam do la chiyores.
So, shall I let you go for lunch?
Ni shela person le khiran zo tanga sa.
Thank you.